Well, shall we begin with a minute's quiet sitting? So, good morning, and let me add my own welcome to that Mark and Willem have offered. As Mark's explained, one of the interesting things about MBCT is that although we decided to focus very narrowly on a particular aim when we designed the treatment, the aim of preventing relapse, reducing relapse and recurrent depression. And indeed, there is good evidence that we were successful, more or less, in achieving that. One of the most interesting things that's emerged is the fact that for many people, and for some to a considerable degree, the program seems to have had much wider effects. So this is a quote from the first MBCT trial in Exeter that Willem and his colleagues did, from a lady for whom the experience of going through the 8-week program had clearly transformed her in many other ways. And to a greater or lesser extent, this is something that's been observed through a range of 8-week programs, mindfulness interventions. And it really raises the issue about how much we can extend MBCT or mindfulness into the wider issues in people's lives. For some people, there is the sense that that 8-week program has offered them a glimpse, an opening of a door into other possible ways of living, the possibility of living life more fully. And a number of people are interested now in trying to work out programs for taking people who want to explore it further based on their experience of the 8-week program into these realms, the more existential realms that mindfulness was originally intended to be part of a program addressing. Now, if one's going to do that, it's enormously helpful if you've got a framework of understanding within which to orientate particular aspects and practices. And what I'd like to do today is to see just how far we can take the framework of understanding that was very important in devising MBCT in the first place, with its narrow focus, into these wider areas. It's something I've been thinking about for a number of years. I've been thinking about it in relation to this framework that was originally developed by my friend and colleague Phil Barnard, and we've had conversations over the years. It's very much a work in progress, but what I'd like to share with you today at a fairly sort of broad brush level is a way of understanding that may help provide answers to these kind of questions. What is it that people are sensing that they feel they're missing? What is it that needs, how is that sense of incompleteness, something not quite right, to be healed? How does mindfulness fit in? What indeed is mindfulness? How can we live with greater ease and joy? What does it mean to talk about mindfulness as a way of being? And what more is possible when people talk about awakening in the sense of enlightenment? What does that really mean? And what more than mindfulness is needed if we're to go into these wider areas? So clearly, this is a somewhat ambitious program, Life, the Universe, and Everything, as I like to call it. And I'll only be able to give you a sort of broad brush approach to it. Nonetheless, it's very important to suggest that because we're going to be covering quite a lot of information, quite a lot that's difficult to take in if you start trying to understand every detail, just to receive this in an open, receptive way. Don't struggle to try and understand the detail. Just trust in the wisdom of your mind to take something from what I'll say, to sort of pick up the recurring themes, if you like. Because if you really focus in on detail, you'll lose the bigger picture. And the way I've arranged this, you'll see each slide, most of them will have numbers at the top, which relate to general themes that help me keep track of where we are, and you'll be able to see how far we've got to go. We'll take a break in the middle, so don't feel too daunted. Okay, so the first theme is really an observation that a number of people have made, which is that in all natural systems, there's a similar deep structure in which simpler patterns are bound together to create more complex patterns, which then themselves are bound together to create even more complex patterns. You can see that in the slide here, where working upwards, we're moving into ever greater levels of complexity. And the name given to this particular structure is a holarchy. And it recurs, if you look closely, in physical systems, biological systems, psychological systems, social systems. And it does that for very good reason, because it provides huge evolutionary advantage. Now, in the mind, the kind of patterns we're interested in here are patterns of information. And the idea is that one of the core principles through which the mind operates is to detect links, some form of relationship between these simpler patterns of information at the bottom, to dissect the relatedness between them, the connection, and then to reflect that in a higher order, a slightly more complex pattern of information. And the nature of the relatedness, the connection between those simpler patterns, can be manifold. It could simply be that they occur at the same time, sounds and sights occur at the same time, or it could be something more subtle. So, for example, if we look at these two shapes and the two sounds, and I ask you which shape goes with takati and which shape goes with alumu, then I would predict that overwhelmingly most of you will say that takati goes with the jaggedy shape and alumu goes with the smooth shape. But it's actually quite hard to be explicit about what the nature of that connection is. But somehow our minds are able to discern a deep commonality between the structures of these very different forms of information at the surface level, sounds, excuse me, and sight. And really, that's the nature of the kinds of connections and relationships that the mind is working in, things that aren't necessarily obvious. And there is, for these sound evolutionary reasons, an inherent tendency in the mind to keep seeking for connections so that you can reflect whatever the lower order patterns of information have in common in higher order patterns, which are then themselves treated to the same process. And it's like the driving force in the mind is constantly looking for this kind of connection, this kind of implicit order that's there in the information and binding simpler patterns together to make more complex ones. And there's sound evolutionary reasons for it. It just makes the mind much more efficient and effective if it organizes itself in this way. And for that reason, as a way to encourage the mind to organize itself in this way, evolution has arranged for our minds to feel good, basically, when things are coherent in this way, when some connection has been detected. So that the idea is that we have this natural tendency to feel at ease and whole when everything is fitting together, and we can create these mental hierarchies all the way up the pyramid. We feel dis-ease and incomplete when they don't fit well together, when there's a lack of coherence through all the different levels of the mind. And one of the key ideas that I want to explore with you is that we can use this natural tendency of the mind, and indeed of the way things are, as a basis on which to organize our lives. The notion is that coherence, relatedness, and wholeness offer us pointers to how we might live with a sense of greater fullness and wholeness. So that, if you like, we've got a compass that we can use to discern how we should actually arrange our lives and minds if we want to have this sense of living more fully, getting more of a sense of being fully alive. So, switching themes, that integrative tendency that I pointed to of bringing simpler patterns together to create more complex patterns is actually the way that all mammals, apart from, as well as us, use to assess the significance of the situations they're in. So that what happens for all mammals is that moment by moment, these constantly shifting patterns of sensory information that are coming to us through the eyes and ears and body, they arrive and they're bound into coherent higher order patterns, which you can think of as mental models that in a way, in their structure, reflect the structure of the information that's come in. So we're creating, if you like, an internal model of what's out there. So that in this situation, unfortunately, the pointer doesn't really work here. But at the bottom, we've got the sort of visual information coming in through the eyes, acoustic through the ears, body state through the body. And the mind of these simpler mammals detects the relationships, the patterns that lie deep between them and among them. And this is reflected in a mental model. And this is created moment to moment to moment, because the pattern of information that's coming in through our senses is constantly changing. So animals are constantly updating the mental models that they're creating. And this is what simpler mammals use to control their action and affect. So the idea is that these mental models allow animals to assess the significance for action of the situation that they're in, enable them to select the most appropriate action, and to anticipate what's coming next. And if you like, these models provide the lens through which an animal, a mammal, perceives the world around it. They give a framework within which it can make sense of things and evaluate what's happening. So, one of the important points I want to make is that here is a way of making sense of what's happening in each moment that has this huge, long evolutionary history. It's been finely honed by millions of years of evolution, and does a pretty good job for most non-human mammals. And we actually retain this capacity to assess the significance of situations, moment by moment, in a holistic way, although most of us aren't generally particularly aware of this capacity that we have. And indeed, one of the main points I want to make is that this integrative capacity of seeing the model that best fits what's happening in this moment, and then in this moment, and this moment, and this moment, actually underlies the basis of a direct, intuitive, holistic kind of knowing. To give you some sense of what I mean by this, let me read you a passage written by Stephen Covey in this book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So this is an experience he had. People were sitting quietly, some reading newspapers, some lost in thought, some resting with their eyes closed. This was in the subway. It was a calm, peaceful scene. Then suddenly a man and his children entered the subway car. The children were so loud and rambunctious that instantly the whole climate changed. The man sat down next to me and closed his eyes, apparently completely oblivious to the situation. The children were yelling back and forth, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. It was very disturbing. And yet the man sitting next to me did nothing. It was difficult not to feel irritated. I couldn't believe that he could be so insensitive to let his children run wild like that and do nothing about it, taking no responsibility at all. It was easy to see everyone on the subway felt irritated too. So finally, with what I felt was unusual patience and restraint, he says, I turned to him and said, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more." The man lifted his gaze as if to come to a consciousness of the situation for the first time and said softly, "Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Can you imagine what I felt at that moment? My paradigm suddenly shifted. Suddenly I saw things differently, and because I saw things differently, I thought differently, I felt differently, I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart was filled with a man's pain. Feelings of sympathy and compassion flowed freely. "Your wife just died. Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me about it? What can I do to help?" Everything changed in an instant. So the key sentence here is my paradigm suddenly shifted. So basically, this kind of holistic intuitive knowing is something that happens all at once with the total pattern of the situation. And in an instant, he switched from one mental model of what was going on to another mental model. And he didn't then have to work out what to do. The response emerged naturally from the mental model. So this is very much how, our earlier mammalian ancestors would have worked. They are sensitive to the total pattern and respond instantly to that. But of course, we also have another way of knowing, one with which we're very familiar, which we tend to equate with knowing generally, the sort of verbal, conceptual, factual knowing. Knowing that here we are in Oxford, that lunch will be at 1 o'clock, that for me, I know this is a thing that I can use to move slides backwards and forwards. I know that here you are expecting some illumination on these difficult topics and so on. And all this is very practically useful stuff. And it was originally developed evolutionarily to help us specifically in goal-focused action. That was its purpose. That was where concepts, which are essentially ideas, that way of knowing, that way of thinking about things arose. And for that very practical, goal-oriented, instrumental purpose, it uses a particular structure of information. It chunks the world into discrete objects, cells, things. that are self-contained, that are like little nuggets, if you like. And at a level of doing things practically, getting things done, making things, communicating with other people, how to get things done in a goal-focused, purpose-driven way, it's brilliant. And that was what it originally developed for. But if we want to feel whole, we need to bind these patterns of conceptual information, which are essentially ideas, together with other patterns of information to create these integrative, holistic, intuitive mental models. So the idea is if we want to feel whole, we've got to create a model in each moment that binds everything together, including our conceptual knowledge, including our thoughts. So if we see here, the idea is that up on the right here, we've got information coming up from the senses. On the left, we've got conceptual information. And the idea is that the system in the mind that handles holistic, intuitive information discerns patterns between these, finds a way of binding them together, tries to find connections in which it can integrate the conceptual, the ideas, with the more sensory stuff that's coming in through our senses in each moment. Now, this isn't a problem so long as we use concepts essentially to label aspects of present experience, so that, it helps me to know that this is a presentation, that you're expecting something, that I need to finish by a particular time, and so on and so on. That's all anchored in the sensory information of the here and now. And that's how conceptual information proves so useful to begin with. However, problems arise in many different forms once we start to use concepts more widely, because although the originally concepts may have been just very handy labels for pulling together the properties of, different forms of a particular idea, we begin to elaborate on them, to have concepts that are really more about the relationships between concepts than they are between concepts and sensory reality. And problems of binding things together arise because ideas can take us far away from the here and now of the sensory information that's coming in. They can be highly abstract. We can think of things that are totally imaginary or so abstract we can't bind them in with the here and now. We can create these totally self-contained worlds within our minds that don't connect with what's happening around us. The kind of multitasking that a conceptual mind enables means that we're trying to interweave and bind together strands of information related to all these different tasks. And most fundamentally, there is a fundamental mismatch between the structure of this kind of conceptual information, which is chunking things into these discrete things, subjects and objects, and the patterns of sensory information that don't do that at all, that they're just coming in terms of complex, constantly shifting patterns that are interdependent, that weave through each other, affect each other, and so on. We've not got this world of separate, independent things that concepts suggest. We've got a much more complicated, connected, interdependent, shifting world. The notion of the river that we can never step into the same river twice, the Heraclitus suggestion, captures that notion very effectively. So, as our minds have evolved and become more and more conceptual, we've experienced more and more difficulties of pulling all the pieces together. And so, these problems in achieving wholeness moment to moment lead to this wholly understandable but fatal step in which we switch to a conceptual goal-based approach. That's been the power all the way along, as Marx said. This means ends problem solving. The doing mind is so effective in working on things in the external world. We think we can apply it to everything. So, and this is a crucial and fatal shift that our minds make. We substitute ideas of what will lead to wholeness, usually related to some form of ideal self-view, as goals to be reached in the future for the actuality of an experience of wholeness to be lived right now. Okay? So concepts, goals in the future. We'll be fine when we get there. The intuitive holistic approach is working here and now, and if it can bind everything together, then we get the sense of wholeness, completeness, fullness now. So this is just graphing this. So this is the doing mind, if you like, where, as Marx said, we create an idea of a goal, in this case, the idea of what will lead to wholeness. We create an idea of the current state, and we then generate these cycles of action, both internal and external, as ways to try and achieve that goal and monitor how close we're getting to it. But unfortunately, this strategy is doomed to failure. It is mission impossible. And there are a number of reasons for that. First off, the ideal self-views, which we've constructed from our sort of conditioning, social and family influences, about I will be happy, I will feel fine if I am the self that is loved by everybody, succeeds at everything, never feels pain, is always safe, has this supply of experiences and things and relationships and jobs and houses that will guarantee me lasting happiness. The kind of things which, when you spell them out, just sound so daft, but actually are what underpins so much of our striving. I mean, this is the ignorance that Buddhism talks about in a way, one aspect of it, so that we're striving to achieve this goal of being a particular kind of self, when in fact that's totally delusory. The possibility of attaining that in any lasting sense is zero, particularly when the goals are in conflict with each other. You know, if I want to be both the ideal partner and parent and child and worker and spiritual person and mindfulness person and the person who fulfills all my to-do list and also leads this rich and fulfilling life and has a wonderful leisure, you know, it just becomes impossible to do it all in the limited time we have. So we're bound to be frustrated. Secondly, we can't do both. We can't actually pursue this goal-driven approach at the same time as working to attain real wholeness by the holistic intuitive integration. And because this conceptual strategy rests on the idea of separate things, this chunked structure, it's built into that way of thinking that I am a separate self and you are over there and these objects that I'm holding aren't part of me, I'm not connected to them. There's a separation built into that view of the world. And so whenever I'm working in that way, it enhances the sense of separation and disconnection. And we've got deeply rooted biological programs that whenever we sense disconnection from our wider social group, we feel low-level anxiety and discomfort. So we suffer. We suffer because it's doomed to chronic frustration, this mission of trying to achieve wholeness conceptually. We have the sense of separation and either obvious distress or more subtle sense of incompleteness, something missing. So if we want to end suffering, we need basically to dump the whole conceptual goal-based approach to wholeness. We don't dump it as a whole, we don't dump it altogether, because clearly it's very useful in all sorts of ways. Where it goes wrong is where, as Marx said, we try to apply it in situations that it just isn't relevant to. And one of the key ones is as a way to achieve the things that we think will give us wholeness. So we need to abandon that approach to wholeness. we need to find more effective ways to bind these two strands of information, the two ways of knowing together, so that we can integrate everything in our mind, the knowing, the sensory experience, into some holistic, intuitive, integrative model from moment to moment that will give us the experience of wholeness. And here, mindfulness arrives on the scene. And mindfulness offers one way to do this. And that's why it feels good. You know, as I said, we're built in a way that inner coherence and everything fitting together, integration, is meant to feel good because it's so effective in helping serve evolutionary purposes. That's why mindfulness feels good. So that the notion here is that mindfulness involves a very fundamental shift in the underlying shape of our minds. From control, our habitual control by this verbal conceptual knowing, which is the way most of us are most of the time. We're constantly giving ourselves ideas about what to do, setting goals, running the narrative about the self and how it's getting on and where it needs to be and what's wrong with it and so on. We shift from that to control by this holistic, intuitive knowing, that integration that's been there all the way along through evolutionary history, but we've not been very well aware of. So that mindful awareness, the subjective experience of mindful awareness, I want to suggest, reflects an underlying shape of mind and heart, which has two key characteristics, and I'll talk about them separately. So just focus on the first one. The first is that we do get this coherence throughout the mind. All the different kinds of information are bound together, including the two knowing systems, the two subsystems that handle knowing, which in those of you who are psychologists will know, that's what's normally called executive structures, the things that the mind uses for higher order control. So that again, don't bother about the details of this. The idea is that the greenness, the green fuzz around everything, is meant to indicate that all these different kinds of information, the patterns at all these different levels, cohere, hang together, there's some connection between them. There's coherence all the way through the mind, including the conceptual and the sensory coming together. That's in one moment. But here at the bottom, we've got these separate time slices, and the idea is that we also have coherence moment to moment to moment, that the models created in one moment cohere with those created in the next, and they're still holding everything together. They're not necessarily the same, but they cohere. There's no horrible change, and this is just pointing to the fact that these two knowing subsystems are involved. Now, this idea that coherence throughout the mind, coherence throughout the brain, some people express it, and involvement of these executive structures, central executive here, two subsystems related to the different kinds of knowing. It's quite a common idea amongst neuroscientists that this is what consciousness is all about. So the conscious awareness aspect of mindfulness, the lucid awareness that Mark spoke of, is reflecting this coherence throughout the system and the involvement of the two knowing subsystems. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that the mindful shape of mind, so that this is actually saying, fine, mindfulness is actually more than simple lucid awareness. It's not just the difference between automatic pilot and being consciously aware. It involves a particular two-way relationship between these two knowing systems that allow the mind both to know itself moment to moment and also to create new integrative models. So because we've got these two subsystems handling the different kinds of information, the conceptual and the holistic intuitive, it's possible for one or the other to be dominant. And the one we're habitually in is this one, where the conceptual way of knowing is in control and we're into goal-based processing. That's how the mind looks when that's in operation. The other way we've got is where the balance is shifted so that the holistic intuitive subsystem is in control and the conceptual is secondary to it. This is what we've got in mindfulness, and this configuration allows the mind to know itself in a particular way and to create new models moment by moment. So this aspect of mindfulness, knowing what's happening as it's happening, was one stressed by the Buddha from the very beginning. These are his instructions to his monks for mindfulness of breathing. Just as a skilled wood turner or his apprentice, when making a long turn, knows I make a long turn, or when making a short turn, knows I make a short turn, so too, breathing in long, he, the monk, knows I breathe in long, and so on and so on. The important point here is that although he has to express it in words, by using this metaphor, the Buddha is clearly pointing to an experiential form of knowing. You know, a skilled wood turner isn't constantly giving himself a commentary. You know, now I'm turning a long turn, now I'm turning a short turn. There's this direct, you could call it non-conceptual, intuitive knowing. It's implicit knowing. What John Kabat-Zinn calls I direct intuitive knowing. And this particular way of arranging the mind with the holistic intuitive in control allows that to happen. Basically, you use one knowing system to know what's happening in the other and then reflect that back to the other. And so they talk to each other and are able to tell each other what's happening moment to moment. We have this direct, intuitive way of having a sense of what's happening moment to moment. It's often called non-conceptual, but this view suggests actually, although we're not thinking in concepts, we are actually, our knowledge is deeply informed by patterns of concepts. So this is the second thing that the mindful configuration does. If we've got the intuitive holistic in control, it makes it easier to create these new integrative models moment to moment. We're binding together the sensory patterns and the conceptual patterns. And we basically, if we're holding something in awareness, as we often do in mindfulness, say holding something difficult in awareness, essentially what it means is that we're bringing it into this cycle, into the holistic intuitive subsystem. We're bringing the information related to that there. We're holding it there, and we're letting these cycles of interaction between the two subsystems sort out a mental model that's going to get better integration, better wholeness of what's happening moment to moment. So that rather than pushing it away, the mind itself works out, helped by our sort of general openness and approach and interest, a way of building a model that enables us to incorporate even the difficult in this moment. Everything that we do in mindfulness is basically conspiring in this direction of trying to help the integration. And the really important thing is that although we can set up the conditions that enable this to happen, that help it happen, we have the intention and we bring in the approach, motivation and the interest and the kindness, the mind does it itself. It uses this inherent wisdom that's evolved over millions of years as a way of fine-tuning the models, creating new models that give us the best fit of what's happening in the moment. So, and this really is just pointing to the fact that all the things about mindfulness, it's present moment focus, doing one thing at a time, seeing thoughts as thoughts, the non-judgmental attitude, we can see all of these as helping that integrative process. They all put the holistic intuitive in charge and enable us to be present focused, where everything can be bound together. So, having spoken at length about mindfulness, let's actually do some. So, could I invite you to put down whatever you've got and mindfully stand. Okay, so I'll be tending to give very brief instructions here. If you can guide yourself as best you can in light of these suggestions. So let's first of all just stretch upwards, stretching the arms up to the sky, feeling the stretch all the way through the body, from the feet, through the legs, torso, arms into the fingertips. And then just feeling, as we lower the arms, the changing physical sensations in the body. Okay, and now, if it feels okay, letting the eyes gently close, or just have them half open if that feels more comfortable. And bringing the awareness down to the feet. And just letting that awareness spread through the feet, exploring the sensations, contact with the floor, sense of the weight pressing down. Just spending a minute or so now, guiding yourself through that mindful exploration. And when you're ready, just opening your eyes. And let's take another stretch upwards. Feeling that stretch throughout the body. And again, when you're ready, gently lowering the hands and arms, aware of the sensations. Allowing the eyes to close, if that's comfortable. If not, just holding them half open. And this time, bringing a kindly, caring awareness. Willem used this word, care, and it's a word I've found very helpful. So, as you bring your awareness to the sensations in the feet, see if it's possible just to have this sense of caring for, almost looking after, nurturing. The sensations you find. Exploring them with a kindly, caring awareness. So they really deserve and need your attention, your awareness, your care and kindness. And then when you're ready, gently opening your eyes. And sitting mindfully back in your places. Okay, now I'd like you just to take a moment or two to reflect on those two ways of bringing awareness to the feet. Consider your experience in those two situations. Would anybody like to comment on anything they noticed between the two? Much the same? Any difference? Yeah.
Okay. I find it difficult to concentrate on my feet just with everything you've just gone through in the talk, and my thoughts were kind of quite buzzing from that. That made it difficult to do just normal practice. So
lots of conceptual mind was busy, and that made it much harder to actually bring that sort of integrative, holding everything together into a mindful awareness. Would that be a fair way to describe it?
That would be right,
And any difference between the two, or the same experience in both?
I was actually better the first time, and it was the second time that my mind had really kind of got going on thinking about stuff.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Anybody else like to comment on any difference between them? Yes, thank you.
I thought that kind attitude brought me closer.
Right. If you just wait till you get the microphone.
The second approach made me more intimate with sensation of my feet.
Right.
Brought me closer.
Okay.
To feet.
So more of a connection with the sensation. Did anybody else have that sense in the kindly, caring one? Yeah. Okay. So a number of people, and this certainly. I mean, I've only tried this exercise a couple of times in situations like this, and this is one of the recurring comments, that both the sense of a greater connection and often sometimes a greater sense of spaciousness. Really the point that I wanted to make from this, as well as taking a break away from the spinning mind, was to emphasize the importance of appropriate affect. That it's something that is stressed in mindfulness training, and it's beautifully expressed in this quote from Christina Feldman. Mindfulness is not a neutral or blank presence. True mindfulness is imbued with warmth, compassion, and interest. In light of this engaged attention, we discover it's impossible to hate or fear anything or anyone we truly understand. Now, I've found this a really inspiring and helpful quotation. It emphasizes these affective qualities of mindfulness. And what I want to do in the next few slides is look at, if you like, the underpinnings of understanding that might help us understand that why the affective side is so important. And there's a general consensus amongst neuroscientists that, like all mammals, our behavior is organized around a limited number of core affects. And each of these different core affects are associated with different shapes of mind, different ways of paying attention, different interpretive worlds. So if we look at the instrumental affects, these are the goal-focused affects, the affects that help us get things done, if you like, the affects underneath doing, related to getting hold of what we want, getting away from or getting rid of what we don't want. These doing affects are associated with a highly selective, narrow style of attention. The mind is only interested in trying to get this thing and any information that isn't immediately relevant to achieving the goal, whatever it is discarded. We just have this very narrow selective focus of attention. It also brings into being a mental world that involves this chunked structure of reality, the idea of separate, disconnected things. Just that, as I said, evolutionarily, this way, these affects were the driving force behind the development of conceptual knowing. And it makes goal achievement much easier if we break the world down in this way into separate, disconnected things rather than try to manage this whole complex interweaving web of information. It also brings, these affects bring a focus on me and my needs. Makes sense if they're goal-focused affects, that's what it's all about. And very importantly, a dominance of this verbal conceptual knowing, because that's the thing that serves the end of achieving the goal. So, because the mindful shape of mind is switched by control, involves this switch out of verbal conceptual dominance to more influence of the intuitive, holistic kind of knowing, it makes perfect sense that if we want to help that switch, we need to disengage these instrumental affects. We need to pull a plug, if you like, on desire, as it would be said in the Buddhist tradition. And so we can see the cultivation of acceptance, allowing, non-striving, non-judgment, letting go, letting be. We can make sense of why we spend so much time trying to cultivate these attitudes as being a reflection of the fact that they are disengaging the goal-focused affects. And in doing that, they take us away from this narrow, self-oriented world of separate things. Non-instrumental affects, by contrast. So these are the affects that aren't related to achieving particular goals, although they're equally, in many ways, more important affects such as care, compassion, and play, interestingly, is one of the core affects that has been identified. And that very obviously isn't related to a particular goal. You're just doing it for the fun of it. And these are linked to a generally more spacious, receptive, inclusive style of attention. And a mental world, the mental world they bring into being is one that is other-oriented, focused on relatedness, connection, and care, rather than separation and division. And it's dominated by this other form of knowing, the holistic, intuitive knowing. So it makes perfect sense that in trying to develop mindfulness, we try to cultivate these non-instrumental affects, kindness and compassion. And the very interesting thing that comes from this view is that, this is integral to the process of mindfulness. It's not just like a nice add-on that it helps, to develop compassion and kindness for the particular mental health issues people are dealing with. It actually helps move into that whole shape of mind. So it's integral. And that's why, in many ways, good mindfulness teachers already do it. They got that intuitive sense that this is what's needed. Like, as Christina Feldman in her beautiful quote, it's not just sort of, and some people need compassion, so we'll weave that in. It is actually core to switching into this different shape of mind. So if I just illustrate these two different styles of attention by, first of all, reading a description of a study that many of you will probably be familiar with. It was a study done by Christopher Shabry and Daniel Simons. They described their experiment like this. Imagine you're asked to watch a short video in which 6 people, 3 in white shirts and 3 in black shirts, pass basketballs around. While you watch, you must keep a silent count of the number of passes made by the people in white shirts. At some point, a gorilla strolls into the middle of the action, faces the camera, thumps its chest, and then leaves, spending 9 seconds on screen, would you see the gorilla? Almost everyone has the intuition that the answer to the question has to be, yes, of course I would. How could anything so obvious go completely unnoticed? In fact, Chabry and Simons found that half the people who watched the video and counted the passes missed the gorilla. They simply didn't see the gorilla. By focusing their attention so narrowly on information relevant to the goal and task in hand, being successful at counting the passes by the white-shirted players, they effectively suppressed all irrelevant information, so the gorilla wasn't actually seen. So there's a very dramatic demonstration of the way in which these instrumental doing affects really change our whole way of attending and interpreting the world. We get a very different sense now, switching to the more non-instrumental affects, the care and the compassion, the kindness affects, from this account of a visit by the Dalai Lama to the meditation center IMS in Barre, Massachusetts. It's written by Sharon Salzberg, who many of you know was a much-loved meditation teacher. And she'd just had a car accident shortly before the Dalai Lama arrived. This is her account of the incident. I was feeling dismal on crutches, especially when I ended up in the back of a huge crowd waiting to greet the Dalai Lama when he arrived. The car with His Holiness arrived at last and was greeted by the cameras, the people, and the armed policemen. The Dalai Lama got out, looked around, and saw me standing way in the back of the throng, leaning on the crutches. He cut straight through the crowd and came up to me as though he were homing in on the deepest suffering in the situation. He took my hand, looked me in the eye, and asked, "What happened?" So here we've got a beautiful example of an expansive, inclusive style of attention, open to the total field of information, alert for any being experiencing suffering, and then ready to home in on it with the motivation to take care of it. So two very different worlds created by these two affects. One self-focused, the other focused. One wide and receptive and open to everything. One very selective and narrowly tuned to the goal. So that gives a sense of the power of affect to affect our shape of mind and why it's so crucial we attend to that dimension in mindfulness training. So let's move on to this new theme, which is really the one that's most relevant to providing a way of understanding what more is needed beyond the 8-week program. Because it's very common experience that we get pulled out of mindfulness so easily by the doing mind, if you want to call it that, by this approach to feeling whole that is trying to achieve being the kind of self that will feel whole. That when things go wrong, particularly with our meditation, that's what we immediately flip into. What can we do if we really want to try to bring this way of being into the whole of our lives, off the cushion and away from the very focused, dealing with the symptoms of depression as they arise? How do we extend the range of it? And particularly if we're actually to live our wider lives in this way, we need to be doing things. We can't just sit there on our cushions all day. What's the alternative to this goal-focused action? What would this mindfulness as a way of being really applied look like? If we were to really live this way for all our lives? Well, fortunately, if you remember, we've got two ways of knowing. We've got two ways of guiding action. The first one we've looked at in detail, conceptual knowing, the idea of the goal and trying to narrow the gap between the present and that. But with a much longer evolutionary history, we've got this way of controlling action with intuitive holistic knowing as a response to the mental model of the moment. So our actions are elicited, if you like, by the situation of the moment and are exquisitely sensitive to that total pattern and will shift from moment to moment rather than just being focused on one future goal. If I read this quote to you from Cynthia Bourgeois, you may get a sense of it. She uses a nice metaphor. She's a contemporary Christian contemplative teacher. And she's in this book, Mystical Hope, as you can imagine, really addressing people interested in more spiritual paths. But she's using this metaphor based on her experience of sailing off the coast of Maine in the US, and particularly sailing in fog, the difference between sailing on a clear day and sailing in fog. So on a bright, sunny day, you can set your course on a landfall 5 miles away from you and sail right to it. But in the fog, you make your way by paying close attention to all the things immediately around you. The deep roll of the sea swells as you enter open ocean, the pungent scents of spruce boughs, or the livelier tempo of the waves as you approach the land. You find your way by being sensitively and sensuously connected to exactly where you are, by letting here reach out and lead you. You'll not learn that in the navigation courses, of course, but it's part of the local knowledge that all the fishermen and natives use to steer by. You know you belong to a place when you can find your way home by feel. All in all, this little metaphor is a pretty good analogy of how these two levels of awareness, she's talking about egoic awareness and what she calls spiritual awareness, actually work. If egoic thinking, in our terms conceptual verbal knowing, is like sailing by reference to where you are not, by what is out there and up ahead in the future, spiritual awareness, holistic intuitive knowing, is like sailing by reference to where you are. It's a way of thinking at a much more visceral level of yourself, responding to subtle intimations of presence too delicate to pick up at your normal level of awareness, but which emerge like a sea swell from the ground of your being once you relax and allow yourself to belong deeply to the picture. Now, that clearly is in a sort of somewhat advanced spiritual contemplative context, but exactly the same kind of way of guiding action seems to be what underpins the much more widely researched and common experience of flow or being in the zone, or what is often called non-doing. This is the experience of the description of a very experienced rock climber when he's climbing. It's like when I was talking about these things becoming automatic here, not meaning automatic pilot, but I'm not doing it, it's happening by itself. Almost like an egoless thing in a way. Somehow the right thing is done without thinking about it or doing anything at all. It just happens, and yet you're more concentrated. It might be like meditation, like Zen is a concentration. And if we look at the description here of a composer on the process of composition, you yourself are in an ecstatic state to such a point that you feel as though you almost don't exist. I've experienced this time and time and time again. My hand seems devoid of myself. I have nothing to do with what's happening. I just sit there watching it in a state of awe and wonderment, and it just flows out by itself. So this man, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, has actually done a lot of research on people who experience flow, mountain climbers, surgeons, composers, painters. And these are two of the aspects of it that I want to draw out particularly as relevant to us. The experience of the activity is intrinsically rewarding, such that often the end goal is just an excuse for the process. So this is clearly not a goal-focused way of running things. It is that moment by moment, action is being guided by the creation of integrative models that bring everything together and which then guide the action in the next step. And flow obtains when all the contents of consciousness are in harmony with each other, which is just another way, this is his hunch of what's underpinning it, of talking about the coherence and integration that I've been stressing as one of the characteristics of mindfulness and the genuine sense of wholeness. And so this fits in very neatly with the idea that the mind responds to wholeness, integration, coherence throughout its levels with feeling good. And again, sort of reinforces this as a pointer to how we might live more fully. So this is one of the core ideas I want to mention here, which is a little bit hard to get your head around, but do what you can. So the idea is that if we think of a painter, they're looking at their what they've already painted. There's a complex pattern of information coming into them, and that they then create a model out of which emerges the response of putting the next stroke of paint on. That then changes what's there to look at in the next cycle, if you like, a slightly different model, and they create another stroke of paint. And so the idea is this one of constantly responding to the situation, which is like variations on a theme. The model stays the same. They don't suddenly start painting a different picture in the same way that in music, from note to note, there is coherence in any one moment between all the different notes played by different instruments. But then when we go to the next time slice, that same model, that same core model is maintained. It's just you've tweaked it a bit. So that the whole essence of music is that we get this variation with continuity. If we just was the same moment after moment, it would be very boring. If it was totally different moment to moment, we'd be all over the place. So the idea is that moment to moment, a continuing core model is refined and fine-tuned in response to new input. So we're creating each moment a new, bespoke, tailor-made model of the moment, if you like. And this is one way of understanding beginner's mind, this constant sense of freshness. I've never actually made this model before. I've got a sort of the core that I'm familiar with, but this particular variation on it is new. And so I am living this wholeness, constantly creating new things. And again, little sense of me doing this. It's all happening by the mind doing it itself, these interactions between the two knowing subsystems. And it feels good because it shows, if you've got the same model or a variant on it going through moment to moment, it shows you actually got a model that fits, and it also saves the mind an awful lot of neuronal energy. So evolutionarily, it makes sense that we would attach good feelings to this. So, coming to the nub, 10 minutes to go. Flow gives us a glimpse of the possibilities of new ways of being that become available when holistic intuitive integration guides action. Flow itself, unfortunately, arises only in very narrow range of conditions. You have to be expert in these areas. You've devoted many years of your life to establishing this repertoire of models that you can deploy in the very narrow focus of your expertise. And you need a particular balance of challenge and skill for flow to emerge. So how can we extend this way of being, this sort of the notion of continuity with variation in the mental models to all of life? How do we awaken to the possibilities of a wider lived experience of wholeness? And basically, we've got to make some radical shifts in our underlying views and affects. The pull of this conceptually dominated doing mind, goal-based approach to wholeness depends on this underlying view of a world of separate subjects, objects, things linked to a dominance of instrumental core affects. So if we want to free ourselves from that pull, we've got to awaken to an alternative underlying worldview linked to holistic intuitive wholeness and these non-instrumental affects, care, compassion, play. So that, as I said, the affect drives the way of seeing the world and the way of paying attention. We need to actually shift both of them because they affect each other. And that alternative view has to be relevant to all experience. So the model that we're trying to modify slightly from moment to moment, some aspect of it has to be relevant to all experience if we want this wholeness to continue. Now, this is the amazing thing. It's already available. I mean, you'd think I'd have to spend years and years working to create these kinds of models, although, as it says, it's not often accessed. And to understand that, I just need to take one more loop into some complexity, and then we can get on to something much more interesting. So if you go back and think, I said that there's an inherent tendency for the mind to keep on seeking and making higher and higher order levels of integration and coherence, constantly seeking for the relationships that will bind things together. And so far we've talked of it as though it stops at the level of mental models, but there's absolutely no reason why it should. This is such a deep core operating principle of the mind that it will just go on regardless, so long as it's got something to work on. So that if we actually now think of the mental models themselves as being the simpler patterns, and these supermodels representing what these different mental models have in common. Okay, these model the mental models themselves. And unbeknownst to us, this creation of all these supermodels has been going on throughout our lives. Basically, they've been extracting the core patterns of the relationships within the mental models we've been making. They form the background deep templates which shape the lenses through which we perceive experience in each moment. And they underpin the structure of the world or reality we inhabit. Different supermodels create different experiential worlds and realities. We can illustrate this, if you like, with the supermodel that emerges from the verbal conceptual way of knowing. The basic structure of language, is subject, object, action. And the structure, the deep structure of verbal conceptual knowing reflects that in this notion of separate, chunked entities, selves, objects, things. And we have so deeply absorbed that core structure into this supermodel that we project out onto the world, that what we see, most of us, most of the time, is this world of separate objects. I feel separate from you. Here is a thing in my hand that is separate from me. I'm here, you're there. This disconnection and separation that's sort of built into language, if you like, follows through into the conceptual way of knowing and into the core models, the supermodels that are extracted from it. We're so familiar with this that we take it as how it is, and we just project this view onto everything, even where it's not relevant. So it's gone way beyond its sphere of convenient application. What other alternative supermodels are available to us? That's the key question. And just to back up a little bit, you're probably familiar with this notion of right brain, left brain. Left brain had been traditionally being associated with verbal conceptual knowing, sort of relatively narrow focus. So that would be a bit like the verbal conceptual knowing I've spoken about. And the right brain related to more holistic, spatial knowing, taking it all in at once. Now, in one of the most thoughtful and thorough analyses of this approach, a recent one by this man called Ian McGilchrist, he's characterized in great detail the nature of the right brain world and the left brain world. And the left brain world is very much as I've described it, separate things in which we're not really connected, that we just play around with juggling concepts. Whereas the right brain world, which is the one that's much more relevant to this holistic, intuitive way of knowing I've been talking about, he describes like this: the right hemisphere pays attention to the other, whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, with which it sees itself in profound relation. It's deeply attracted to and given life by the relationship, the betweenness that exists with this other. We experience a world with which we are deeply connected. We are intimate with the world rather than separate from it. And to this world, we exist in a relationship of care. This isn't just a lump of plastic that's handy to me. It's something that I can care for because so much work and thinking has gone into it. And without it, I would be in a difficult position up here. So I can connect with this thing that changes the slides, with this relationship of connection and care. Relatedness is all about what sits in the middle between. So rather than there being you and me, relatedness is what sits between us. And it brings on this whole affect of care. And Willem's word care is one I keep coming back to, and it's so interesting that McGilchrist, in his very scholarly analysis, comes back to that same notion. So if we think of this more holistic, intuitive world as having these underlying dimensions of relatedness and care, we can think of these supermodels that are potentially available. We can apply them to all experience. There's no experience that I can't connect with. There's no experience I can't relate to. There's no experience I can't care for. With certain modifications of my normal style, but these are our hidden treasures. They are there available to us, but we don't access them. And accessing these supermodels, we do feel connected to a larger whole. We'll feel this unconditional care and love and sense some deeper dimension of wholeness shining back to us. So rather than the thingness of this disconnected world that's alien to us coming back from us, there is this sense of connection and lovability and wholeness shining back through each experience. Now, often this accessing this happens in some form of epiphany, and you can get a flavor of what that involves from this quotation from Thomas Merton. Now, Thomas Merton was one of the most highly respected Christian contemplatives of the 20th century. And he had this renowned epiphany one day when he was out shopping in Louisville, actually at the corner of 4th and Walnut in the center of the shopping district. And this is how he describes it. I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we couldn't be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. A member of the human race, to think that such a commonplace realization should suddenly seem like news that one holds the winning ticket in a cosmic sweepstake. It is because I'm one with them that I owe it to them to be alone. And when I am alone, they are not they, but my own self. There are no strangers. And he goes on to say, then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depths of their hearts where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality. If only they could all see themselves as they really are, if only we could see each other that way all the time, there would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. And from that epiphany, Thomas Merton's underlying view, the worldview that he worked from, changed for the rest of his life. And he was able, obviously not necessarily all the time, in every moment, to bring this alternative model, supermodel, to bear. Just by way of conclusion, let me refer to a quote by Einstein that you're probably very familiar with, it, because John Kabat-Zinn uses it, others do, which is really pointing to the same conclusion. A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. That's our usual way of seeing things. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So our task to free ourselves from this prison, in my terms, accessing these alternative supermodels, it does actually require the kind of cultivating the ethical behavior, wisdom, letting go of self, and unconditional care, all these bigger, more challenging requirements that are emphasized in all contemplative traditions, as well as paying attention in a particular way. So this is the challenge that we face if we want to extend what we get a glimpse of in the 8-week program into a way that is really radically going to change our lives and those around us. So thank you.
Are you okay to take a few questions?
Yeah.